We've spent a lot of time discussing the causes of World War I and why it happened the way that it did in 1914. Today we're going to start talking about the actual fighting of World War I, starting with the opening moves made by the countries. Austria-Hungary opened fire on Serbia. Russia mobilized its forces. Britain prepared its British Expeditionary Force, and Germany began implementing its Schlieffen Plan. Let's take a look at the objectives of the Schlieffen Plan. It was pretty simple to understand. The Germans felt like they could use the majority of their forces to have a quick victory over France in the west, and then they would transfer those forces east to defeat the Tsar's army in Russia. They did not expect a very long, drawn-out war and felt very confident in their ability to have victory. However, the Schlieffen Plan was a major failure for several reasons. If you look at the bottom of pages 39 and the top of page 40, you can see some reasons why the Schlieffen Plan did not achieve the objectives that the Germans were hoping for. For one, the Belgian resistance was strong, and that was something that the Germans did not expect. Also, because Belgium was invaded by the German troops, the British decided to prepare its forces because they were mad at Belgium being invaded the way that it was. Additionally, the German forces were weaker in France because the Russian forces were mobilizing quicker than expected, and more German forces were forced east. As a result, the Germans panicked a bit and ended up going down into Paris from the east instead of from the west. Therefore, the British and French troops were able to meet them at a different way at the Battle of Marne on September 9th. This particular battle is sometimes referred to as the Miracle of the Marne, and it showed the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. And it also showed that this war was not going to be over quickly. It was going to be long and drawn out. After the Battle of the Marne, both armies followed a quote-unquote race to the sea and resulted in the building of trenches along the Western Front in the country of France. The trenches themselves were a major feature of World War I due to the conditions of the fighting and the fact that it delayed and slowed down the war quite a bit. If you look at the map at the bottom of page 40 of your book, you can see where this line of trenches developed, and also some of the major attacks led by both the Allied troops and the German troops in these years of World War I. Now let's go year by year to see some of the major events that happened in World War I, starting with 1915. There was a stalemate that resulted in 1915 for several reasons. One of the biggest reasons is because the overall use of trenches. With trenches, soldiers dug themselves in, and it was very difficult to make any type of real advance because of the conditions of the fighting. With the introduction of grenades and poison gas, soldiers found it very difficult to advance farther than a couple of miles or even a couple of hundred yards. And because of this, stalemate resulted. There were also in 1915 several unsuccessful attempts by the British and French troops. And it's also when the Germans started using some of that poison gas, which required enemy troops to develop gas masks and other types of attempts to counter the poison gas. Now let's move on to the year 1916, which was highlighted by two very significant battles, the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. Both of these battles failed to achieve their objectives and were also horrible in the amounts of people that died on both sides, the Allied side and the German-led side. Starting with the Battle of Verdun in 1916, it was a German-led assault against this French city of Verdun. If you look at page 41, you can see the plans for the Germans by their commander Erich von Falkenhayn, and also underneath there you can see a political cartoon that kind of shows you the results of this battle and how horrific they were. There were attacks followed by counterattacks, but finally by April of 1916, the French counterattacks pretty much forced the Germans to stop. There were over 800,000 killed, and that broke previous records for amounts of killing. Clearly, this showed to the Germans once again that this battle, this war, was not going to be over quickly, and that they were going to be losing huge amounts of men in the process. It's also important to consider why the French were more victorious in this battle. You have to remember back to the Franco-Prussian War, the resentment that the French people had towards the Germans after that war for the loss of their territory, the amounts of reparation. It was a huge blow to their national pride. With this battle, as horrific as it was in terms of loss of life, the French felt a renewed sense of pride in their country and that they could be successful over the Germans in this war. Now let's look at the Battle of the Somme, which was the first use of tanks in the war. This was an assault led by the British as opposed to the Battle of Verdun. It began on July 1st of 1916 and lasted through to the following November. This battle can't really be considered a victory for either side, as both sides suffered huge losses and made only limited advances of a few hundred meters at a time at the most. Both of these battles proved that there were small gains made by either side, which make it difficult to classify either of the battles as a victory for either side. It also showed the role that trench warfare had in extending and delaying and drawing out the conflict due to the inability to advance any real distance. Now let's turn our attention to the year 1917, which saw the entry of the United States, for several reasons, and the exit of the Russian forces due to a revolution that broke out in their country. In February of 1917, the Germans withdrew behind what was known as the Hindenburg Line, which was a series of fortifications in northeast France, which would make it a little bit easier for them to defend their position. However, the first part of 1917 still showed a stalemate on both sides due to the difficulty of advancement because of the trench fighting. But the USA's entry into the war brought a sense of hope to the Allied troops. Let's take a look at some of the reasons why the U.S. entered the war. If you look at the bottom of page 42, it outlines some of the factors. Initially, the U.S. did not want to take part in this conflict whatsoever. In fact, President Woodrow Wilson campaigned for his second run at the presidency in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But there were some events that happened which made war inevitable for the United States. The German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare involved attacks on American ships and also ships held by some of the other Allied powers which carried American passengers, such as the Lusitania. Additionally, there was the Zimmermann telegram, which was sent to Mexico from Germany. And basically, it encouraged Mexico to enter the war on the side of the Central Powers. And in return, the Germans promised the Mexicans that following the victory in World War I, the Mexicans would receive back some of the land that was taken from them in the Mexican-American War back in the 1840s. When the United States intercepted this telegram, it caused huge outrage that the Germans would try to provoke one of our neighbor countries to enter the war against the Allied forces. We saw it as a direct threat upon us. Additionally, you could consider the Sussex Pledge of 1916, in which the Germans promised not to attack civilian ships. They broke this promise, and more ships were targeted and civilians, which further outraged the American people and led them to believe that the Germans could not be trusted. There was a lot of propaganda also coming from the British to the United States, which made the Americans feel even more biased against the Germans. So the factors of unrestricted submarine warfare led by the Germans, combined with the Zimmermann telegram and the role of propaganda, making the American people feel more biased against the Germans, resulted in an outbreak of war feeling on the American side. It was a good thing that the United States forces entered World War I when it did, because Russia exited the war due to an internal revolution that broke out in their country from a group of people known as the Bolsheviks. Eventually, the success of this revolution would lead to the establishment of the Soviet Union. But because of the internal problems in their country, they could not continue to assist in the fighting of World War I. So the U.S. sort of filled in the gap that Russia had left. Now let's take a look at the final year of fighting, which was in 1918. This resulted in a victory for the Allies, but not without a huge cost. If you look at the bottom of page 43, you can see that German commander Erich Ludendorff basically tried to put it all on the line and risk everything on a quick victory known as his peace offensive. He basically wanted to smash through Allied lines and make huge advances, which we've already seen was very difficult to do because of the trench fighting. The Germans did have some success in this. In March of 1918, 35 German divisions made gains of about 65 kilometers against the British. In April, there was another big breakthrough in Flanders that threatened Allied control of the Channel ports. In fact, there's a very famous poem written about this battle in Flanders, which shows the amount of loss of life. By May of 1918, the German troops were very close to Paris again, but there were some problems that were creeping up that made it too difficult for any real victory. They had overstretched themselves to the point where they could not continue fighting, and they didn't have any reserves left to call upon. The Allies used this as their opportunity to mass their forces under the control of General Ferdinand Foch, and they began using planes and tanks to mass their growing forces against the Germans. There was a last-ditch effort made by the Germans in July of 1918, which met stiff opposition and an inability to make any real progress. Finally, in August of 1918, what Ludendorff called Black Day, the Allies achieved the furthest advance ever since the beginning of the war. In September of that year, the Allies had reached the Hindenburg Line, which was that line of fortifications in France that the Germans had retreated to previously. And at this point, the Germans were suffering from a whole host of problems, including low morale, starvation, lack of supplies, and the fact that its allies had already been surrendered, such as Austria-Hungary. Ludendorff pretty much gave up and requested the Kaiser to request an armistice without any further delay. He realized there was no point in continuing the fight if his troops could not have the supplies they needed or the morale or the assistance of the Allies to back them up. So finally, on November 11th, 1918, the armistice came into effect and ended the fighting between the Allies and the Germans. You can look at the terms for the armistice on page 44. The reason we have Veterans Day now is because of the anniversary of the signing of the armistice. It was agreed at 5 o'clock a.m. on November 11th, and it was to come into effect at 11 o'clock a.m. Paris time. So therefore, it would be the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and which is why we celebrate Veterans Day every year. Some of the terms of the armistice you can see on the bottom of page 44 included the termination of military hostilities within 6 hours, removal of German troops from different territories including France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Also, you'll notice Alsace-Lorraine is included, which was that area that the Germans had taken back in the battle against France in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. So the agreement was signed by the German delegation, which signaled the end of the war in the Western Front.